Hello everyone, welcome to the next episode of the Silk Road Revival. Today with us Professor Christian Ahlin from the Michigan State University. Before we start, I want to briefly introduce you to our audience. Professor Christian Ahlin is an associate professor at Michigan State University. He holds a PhD from the University of Chicago. And Professor Ahlin teaches development economics as an elective course for undergraduate students, economics program students, and second year graduate students, postgraduate students. My first question, Professor, what made you choose development economics?
That's a good question. Part of it was spending a year in Kazakhstan, actually, which is right next door, I guess, to Uzbekistan. After undergraduate, I spent a year in Kazakhstan, and before that, was already very interested in international issues and not just the U.S. economy and U.S. outcomes, culture, but more of a global view. And then spending a year in Kazakhstan definitely whet my appetite for the question of how do countries develop and why some countries are not as developed as others, and what are the key impediments or roadblocks, and what can be done to improve development. And so that plus one of my favorite professors and nicest people in the department at University of Chicago was doing development. That's Robert Townsend. Uh, and so that helped as well.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Thank you. And my next question: can a country's nighttime lights from space show how fast its economy is growing?
Yeah, I think that can be one indicator that can be helpful. It's not perfect, obviously, but the good thing about it is it's unbiased, and so it can be a nice corrective to official figures if things are not
Mhm.
being reported accurately. I think that's the best use of it. The second is, maybe getting, yeah, where GDP is hard to measure, that can be a helpful
Mhm.
corrective. On the other hand, it has its issues. Not all GDP lights up lights to the same degree, and so it's clearly measured with error. But as part of the set of statistics we look at for a country, it may even be the best for some countries. So I think it could be helpful.
Mhm. Uh-huh. And my next question: why did Africa lag behind during the colonial era, despite its geographic proximity to Europe and Asia? For like, it may like, for example, like America, kind of being far, they were like lagged behind in development. But when it comes to Africa, despite them being very close to this Europe or Asia, they kind of lag behind in in development. What do you think the reason?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I haven't done any direct research on that.
Mhm.
I'm familiar with some of the research focusing on institutions and uh, looking at how colonialization of Africa looked different from, say, how it did in the US or
Mhm.
in Australia. Uh, and that when you develop extractive institutions in your colonial strategy, that can persist over time. I think that's probably the leading theory for your question, answering your question. There's work on the slave trade as well and how that interacts with trust institutions. Uh, and yeah, I'm sure there are other issues as well. Um, it's uh, colonialism obviously brought a lot of kind of negative consequences for indigenous people. wherever it was. And some paradoxical things, for example, the degree to which outside colonizers took over and set up good institutions actually predicted good outcomes in the future, uh, and where they kind of were content to remain a small minority, and actually things maybe worked out worse in some ways. But yeah, I think it's a puzzle. Going forward, certainly institutions, I think, are a big part of the answer for Africa. How you tackle those, a tough question, but I think that would be a big part of it.
Uh-huh. And my next question is corruption is always bad, or does it have some benefits to the country?
Great question. Theoretically, you can think about both cases. Uh, so the paper that was my dissertation that I worked on, that was kind of inspired by my time in Kazakhstan. It's pretty bad. It acts as a tax on entrepreneurship. That's one thing you don't want to do, is overtax your entrepreneurial sector if you're developing. Uh, you and corruption can do exactly that, overtax, due to several issues. The tax level isn't set by the electorate. The tax level may be set by sort of competition that's or sort of externalities and a competitive setting between bureaucrats that leads to over extraction. So anyway, uh, so that clearly corruption can have some negative effects. Um, and that's sort of, I like to break corruption. I don't know how long you want me to answer this question. I could answer for 5 or 10 minutes, uh, if that's all right. But I like to break corruption into two types, and roughly good for firm or bad for firm, good for business or bad for business. So my dissertation paper was very much about corruption that's bad for businesses, just an extra tax, doesn't provide them any good, just a pure negative. And that kind of corruption exists, sometimes called extortion. It exists, and you can see it in several empirical papers. And that tends to lead to just negative attacks on the private sector, a halt on, impediment to development. Good for firm corruption. Uh, this is where firms are actually gaining from corruption. Maybe they're bribing their way to avoid a regulation or to get a contract. This is where it becomes, I think, a little more uh, um, not obvious whether it's going to be good or bad for development. Because what good for firm corruption does, it essentially eliminates or reduces the government's ability to regulate, tax, procure, et cetera, to carry out government functions. When you have corruption in that good for firm sense, you have firms and officials colluding essentially. And what they're doing, among other things, is making it hard for the government at large to do what it's trying to do, whether it's tax, regulate, procure, et cetera. So, so that kind of hamstrings government capacity, that type of corruption. And, this is where people have argued corruption can be good. And why? Well, if the government backdrop, if the government setting is one of dysfunctionality, the government's just trying to do silly, irrational, greedy things, then maybe corruption can actually help the country get around, the private sector get around crazy regulations or crazy taxes and actually develop despite all that backdrop of dysfunction. So that goes back to the 60s, an argument made. Um, on the other hand, if you have a relatively functional government responsive to the electorate, then presumably most of their goals are at least somewhat rational. And now corruption, even though it might have some benefits to firm bottom lines and ability to operate, it reduces the government's ability again to tax, regulate, correct externalities, et cetera. And so still maybe on net quite a negative for development. So, but to answer your question, I think there are certainly cases where corruption can be uh, a way for a country to develop, even though there are lots of sort of either legacy or current obstacles through the government that are keeping them from developing.
Mhm. Uh-huh. Thank you, Professor.
Yeah,
So, and my next question isn't education in general too long? For example, people like study 11 or 12 years at school and plus like 4 years and like also like 8 years or something at the university. So don't you think like it's a bit too long? Like education, in general, educational system. I mean, like students, like cannot like maybe this is a reason why we are not having, another, like for example, Leonardo da Vinci, you know, because they were kind of free explorers. I mean, I guess like we are not leaving the room for learning, only for studying. So what do you think? Like, isn't it too long? Shouldn't we shorten it?
a good question. Yeah, this is well outside my expertise, but kind of as an economist, I'll take a stab at it, but haven't fully thought this through at all. So, but yeah, I think you have two questions there. One is how we educate. Is it too sort of textbooky and sort of formulaic, and we need to be more out there in the real world, with real stakes and real
Mm-hmm.
projects and that kind of thing. And that's a good question. I think that there's probably a case to be made for that. That and there are certain, at least in the United States, certain educational strategies in schools that stress more kind of self-driven creativity projects, outdoors, things like that. It's certainly not dominant, but it's out
Mm-hmm.
there. Um, and yeah, what about so the mode of education? Is sitting at a desk in a classroom?
Mm-hmm.
Is that the best way to go about it? And that relates to, do we spend too much time? Maybe a mix of sitting at a desk and getting out in the real world would be best. But do we spend too much time sitting at a desk? Um, it's a good question. I think haven't thought too much about it. One thing's for sure is there's more to learn these days. And if you want to get into a technical field, you need that much education at this point. I don't know how AI may change things, but take economics. There's really no shortcuts to skipping any parts of the curriculum that I know of. Maybe we could tweak it, optimize it, get people to the frontier faster. But um, there's a lot to learn, um, and of course, some professions you might be able to learn more quickly without many years. Um, the issue, though, I think one of the issues is all-purpose learning and the ability to learn. That's a lot of what we get from education, I think, formal education, ideally. And so, um, if you just learn a trade, have you learned how to be flexible? What if your trade disappears
Mm-hmm.
or it gets curtailed by some future technological developments? So, being able to learn, and I certainly think, classroom or not, we should all be lifelong learners, and um, that's unavoidable in some professions. If you're in tech, your technology is changing every 1, 2, 5 years, and you're having to learn new stuff all the time.
Mm-hmm.
If you're in teaching calculus, you don't have to learn anything new, really, probably very little. Um, but depending on your profession, there's a lot, you have to be a lifelong learner, but regardless of what your profession is, obviously it's a good idea to be always learning, always curious.
Mhm.
That's one of the blessings of being a professor is always learning and always thinking. And it's certainly one thing that makes the job interesting.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think certainly some people are probably overeducated in terms of number of years. You'd have to look at field as well. Some fields, a PhD might not be worth as much, in my opinion. Uh, uh, Others, I think a PhD in economics is really great training uh, for many different things.
Mhm.
Uh, so yeah, those are some thoughts on that.
Mhm. Like yeah, I asked it because I used to have friend like, and he was very into the math, but like he kind of learned a lot math at fifth grade, but by now he's studying in 11th grade, but like he kind of start to hate because of the pressure, exams, everything, like kind of keep kind of teaching this math, and now he kind of doesn't like math as much as when he was like younger. So yeah, uh,
Well, yeah, certainly the way we teach matters, and
mhm,
the pressure and things like that can certainly probably turn an interesting subject into one that becomes less interesting and more onerous. My
mhm,
son loves math, but it's you know I don't think he's been under a lot of pressure.
mhm,
But yeah, it's staying curious. That's certainly if you're going to be in academia, I think that's a prerequisite.
mhm. Thank you, Professor. So those were my all questions for part one, and for part two, I chose a research paper that
Can
is
I
called uh huh that is
can I
called like
ask you?
uh huh.
So what led you to this podcast?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like first like uh I was kind of into like physics, but my parents said like it's kind of too late. I mean, yeah, too late to learn physics. But then, like the only choice I had like economics, but I kind of wasn't interested in economics because I kind of didn't like economics. Is a bit too abstract, more abstract than physics. Like you cannot see everything in economics. I mean, happen going on if you don't do not dig into it. So yeah, I kind of started to do some kind of research. Like I mean, not research. I kind of start to immerse myself into like the field of economics. Like I start reading some books relate about economics, and also like yeah, start to watch some videos on YouTube. Like of more like one of them like I cannot remember, but there's like yeah one good YouTube channel. Like I kind of watched and I kind of got interested in it. So and also start to do podcasts, and like I had some questions, like I kind of what I was interested in, and those questions like that I asked turned out to be like related to kind of economics. So yeah, and I kind of started to send like these invitations to some professors that I was interested in their like for example research papers, and also yeah I guess yeah this I really like yeah like I got kind of interested in it, so yeah I'm kind of trying to build my interest in economics. Yeah.
Great.
Uh-huh.
Are you in undergraduate now?
Yeah, at high school.
Okay.
Yeah. And all right, for part two, I chose your research paper that is called like group lending, matching patterns, and the mystery of miscredit evidence from Thailand. So my first question about this research paper: how does group lending help safe borrowers get a fair deal on loans without handing over collateral?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, there are a number of. It's a big question, and there are a number of answers, and they go back to sort of what's causing markets to break down in lending when you don't have collateral. And there are a couple of what market frictions that we talk about that would cause those markets to break down such that people can't get loans or get them only at very high rates, very few people. And those frictions would be adverse selection or hidden type, moral hazard or hidden action. There are various, you can also think of costly state verification, limited enforcement, sometimes lumped together with hidden action. So yeah, it depends on the answer to your question depends on what's wrong with credit markets.
Mm-hmm.
But it turns out that group lending can be, you examine a patient who's sick, you try to figure out what's wrong, and then what's the antidote, what's the medicine. Group lending can be the medicine for multiple ailments of the credit markets. And that's interesting. So in this paper, though, the ailment we're looking at is a particular one. It's adverse selection.
Mm-hmm.
And let me try to explain that. That's the idea that if a lender goes into a village, doesn't know anybody, no one has credit history, there is no information about who's risky, who's safe, meaning if they get a loan, will they do something risky with it? Will they do something safe with it? Will they be able to repay? Will they not be able to repay at the end of the day? So if the lender has no idea who's who, then the lender would just charge say an average rate that sort of averages out the risk from very risky people and very safe people, or the whole range of risky and safe. Some kind of average risk-based rate.
Mm-hmm.
But that rate might be too high for safe borrowers.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Well, they know they're going to succeed with high probability. They know they're going to have to pay the loan back with high probability. And if you're paying a high rate with high probability, that's a high payment. Whereas someone who knows they're risky, they're not going to pay back with high probability. They can sign on to a high rate, but know that they're not going to be paying it with very high probability. So it's more palatable to them. So anyway, what happens is safe borrowers can drop out of the market, and you end up as a lender not being able to reach the safe side of the market, say the upper tier. And that could be an upper 10%, it could be an upper 80%. You could lose almost all the market. It depends on how the math works out. You could basically what's sometimes called a death spiral in the context of health insurance. If you charge a moderate rate, you lose a bunch of safe borrowers. Now you have to raise your rate because your pool got riskier. You lose even more safe borrowers. And this keeps going till you reach an equilibrium, possibly having lost almost all your borrowers, and only serving a very risky tail at very high rates. So that's the ailment. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah.
I haven't gotten to how group lending can help solve it, but all that detail is kind of necessary if you want to understand how group lending solves it. But just wanted to check and see if you want to follow up before I forge ahead with talking about how group lending can help in that context.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Professor.
So far, so good. So far, so good.
Yeah.
Okay. So let me talk about group lending then. So what happens with group lending is it only works in this context if borrowers don't suffer from the same lack of knowledge that the lender does. The lender doesn't know who's risky, who's safe. But let's say borrowers do. They're in the same village, they know each other, and you form groups where they co-sign each other's loans within the group. Essentially, they bear liability. Now, what happens is, it's kind of an intricate argument, goes back to my tree Scott talk, that borrowers will form groups endogenously in equilibrium, sort of purely voluntarily. They'll form groups with similar borrowers to themselves. So if I'm safe, I'm going to match with a safe borrower. If I'm
Mm-hmm.
risky, I match with a risky borrower. Now that enables the lender to essentially charge different rates by risk. And the reason is, if I'm a safe borrower, what's my rate? Well, it's the rate I'm paying on my loan, plus the probability I have to bail out my partner times the rate of bailout.
Mm-hmm.
But my partner's very safe. So I have a relatively low bailout probability and therefore low overall interest rate. If I'm risky, I sign the same contract, but my partner is risky. And so I have a high bailout probability. So my overall expected interest rate is high. And essentially, the lender is able to differentiate the interest rate by risk without knowing anything. And that enables the lender potentially under some parameter values to draw back in the safe borrowers because they're getting lower effective rates.
Mm-hmm. So group lending is choosing the right partner, like something related to that, like.
Very much depends on choosing the right partner, but it's not the lender choosing the partner,
Uh-huh.
assigning partners in this model. It's the borrowers themselves who are self-selecting, kind of like you have a big class and you're riding a bus to a field trip. Who sits with who on the seats?
Mm-hmm.
You get to self-select. Of course, there are constraints. There has to be an equilibrium. We can't all choose, the pretty girl or the cool guy. Um, Only one person can sit with that person, but you you know you find an equilibrium, and that's where game theory comes in, and that's sort of a stable set of groupings, but
Mm-hmm.
it's decentralized. No one's forcing it. The lender isn't choosing it. The uh, the borrowers themselves are forming their groups, which is how many microfinance institutions operate. They leave group uh, composition mostly to the borrowers themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so you self-form these groups in equilibrium, you get what homogeneous matching, and then that has positive properties in this context.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Professor. And
Yeah.
my next question: what is a hidden drawback when people pick their own group members for a microloan?
Yeah. So one thing we come to in this paper uh, is that the story I just told, homogeneous matching works very well
Mm-hmm.
um, in favor of efficiency. Uh, but that's, in a way, almost by accident. It doesn't have to be that way. And so
Mm-hmm.
we show that there's another dimension that people might match on that actually works against efficiency. And that is in this context. So I've been talking about the amount of risk, but what about the type of risk?
Mm-hmm.
So let's say you have a village, some people farm, you know, what do we farm in Uzbekistan? Cotton or
Yeah, cut. Yeah, cotton.
so let's say we have half of the village are cotton farmers and half are vegetable growers. And let's say the risks are different for those two crops.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, if the weather's bad for cotton, all the cotton farms are going to suffer, but the vegetable farmers might be okay, and vice
Mm-hmm.
versa. So, who am I going to match with? Well, what would be best for efficiency and for the contract would be if I'm a vegetable farmer, I match with a cotton farmer. And so we can kind of insure each other, and joint liability will work
Mm-hmm.
when I co-sign for my partner, if my cotton farmer partner fails, there's a chance I'll be able to bail him out and vice versa.
Mm.
But what actually happens in practice is you will tend to see that people will match with someone who faces similar risk.
Mhm.
Uh, so cotton farmer will match with a cotton farmer. Why? Well, in the model, it's because, I mean, there are a number of reasons practically why that might be the case, but what we're focused on here is how does that affect your contract? And well, if you're co-signing for someone who's always going to fail when you fail, well, then co-signing is costless to you, right?
Mhm.
Because you, when your partner fails, you have nothing to offer to bail them out. So in this model, you're off the hook. So you'll end up seeing people sort of pile on covariant risk in
Mhm.
the matching process, and that works against improved risk pricing. So anyway, even within the matching process, uh, it's not sort of a deep law of economics that decentralized matching will always work in favor of contracts. It works well in the dimension that we focused on, which is the amount of risk, but it works less well when we're talking about the type of risk. In fact, it works against efficiency. So uh, group lending, it depends, but it may not be able to, it's kind of like a medicine that has certain side effects, won't work for everyone,
Mhm.
or it has certain, you know, complementary conditions that either make it more or less effective. The other thing, though, is that the lender could potentially step in and rather than allow matching to be decentralized based on occupation, can maybe create some stipulations about groups that have to have at least a mix across occupations or something like that might help solve the problem, although might raise other problems as well. But we're in the world, by the way, of we're far from the sort of perfect markets scenario here. Markets aren't operating perfectly. Fixes are helpful potentially, but maybe not perfect, etc. So it's sort of the messy world of economics of lending.
Mhm. Thank you, Professor. My next question: do real-life microloan groups in Thailand actually match up the way economics theory says they should?
Well, what this paper found is theory is very stark. It says, if you write down a simple model that you'll get identical matching, like you'll see people match with people who are identical or at least rank ordered matching. So the two safest people in your data set would match together and then the next two and then the next two. And a very stark prediction. Um, we don't see anywhere close to that. But what we are able to show is that you can quantify what a random match would look like. Like what if people just randomly match, completely randomly? And what we see is we're closer to theoretical matching, where you match with someone similar to yourself. We can reject random matching, statistically speaking, in the direction of what we call homogeneous matching. So they are matching with people similar to themselves, not
Mhm.
perfectly,
Mhm.
but better than random, better than random matching, further closer to homogeneous matching than random matching would give. So it does look like it's purposeful matching, or at least it's consistent with purposeful matching with some frictions, maybe. Um, you don't get the full frictionless theoretical outcome, but you do get something that's moving in that direction.
Mhm. Uh-huh.
In other words, my partner is closer to more similar to who I am than he would be if it was just randomly assigned.
Mhm. Uh-huh. Got it. And my last question for this research paper: Why do group members have different jobs but still end up broke at the same time?
Can you repeat that?
Yeah. Why do group members have different jobs but still end up broke at the exact same time?
Broke?
Yeah.
Yeah. Good question. So the model, I don't know how much economic theory you've read, but obviously the real world is complicated. And
Mm-hmm.
a lot of what an economic model does is strip away some of that complexity and simplify the world, create kind of a simple model world
Mm-hmm.
where we hope, well, the insights we get from understanding that model world will carry into the real world. Uh, so this model is simplified in some ways. Uh, for example, you either succeed or you completely fail. Uh, Obviously, the real world isn't like that. There are different shades of success and failure, infinite shades, really. Uh, but here, there are only two. You either succeed or you fail. So that's just to simplify our analysis and make things clear. Uh, but but yeah, in our model, there's a chance. Anyone has a chance to completely fail. And if you put two people together, they both have a chance of completely failing, no matter what they're doing. And so then there's a chance that they both completely fail too. Um, if risk is independent, it's just the probability of each one failing multiplied by each other. So, does that fit the real world? Well, yes and no. I mean, the chances that two businesses literally completely fail at the same time may be fairly low, but it's certainly possible that even if they're in different industries, different businesses, they both happen to mostly fail or roughly fail at the same time. Certainly a possibility, even if small. I don't know if I'm getting at your question, but
Uh-huh. All right. Yeah. Thank you. Uh, so my so moving on, like I had some questions about your research paper that is called "Effects and Intraceability and Traceability of Decentralized Corruption." What's the difference between split regions and multiple agencies, and why do extra agencies drive up bribes?
yeah, in my paper, I'm kind of looking at two types of decentralization. You can think of it as, uh, think of it maybe in the context of Russia, maybe, where you have oblasts, regions. And if you want to start a business within an oblast, you have to pay maybe multiple agencies or bureaucrats within the region. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
so in that paper, regional decentralization would be like the number of oblasts that are operating independently to some degree. And then bureaucratic decentralization would be how many bureaucrats do you pay per oblast
Mm-hmm.
if you're setting up a firm in that oblast. So, so that's kind of the two dimensions there. One is sort of, in one sense, regional decentralization is just saying what you only have to pay the region you operate in. But bureaucratic decentralization, how many bureaucracies within that region do you have to pay? And the idea would be like, maybe you have to pay a tax inspector, a mayor, a sanitation inspector, a fire inspector, building code inspector, et cetera. You may have to pay multiple bureaucrats in order to keep your firm operating legally. Uh, and what that paper shows is that those two types of decentralization can have different effects, not only on the corruption level, but on how effective anti-corruption mechanisms are in lowering the corruption level. But yeah, the bureaucratic decentralization, this goes back beyond, a couple decade beyond before my paper. The the number of bureaucrats you have to pay raises the overall bribe level under basic assumptions. And basically, it's because there's an externality there. If if I'm just paying one bureaucrat, that bureaucrat is setting the level of bribes required at a level that doesn't drive away all the entrepreneurs. That would not be good, right? If you require $1 million to operate a firm, you may have very few firms paying that. You may not get much revenue in bribery. But if you require a moderate amount, you may get a bunch of firms operating and paying the amount. So basically, the idea is that a bureaucrat is disciplined by the demand curve, won't charge too much, otherwise would drive away businesses who would otherwise pay bribes. But the thing is, when you add another bureaucrat, now if that bureaucrat's thinking how much to charge, if he says, well, I'll raise my fee, he's thinking, yeah, that's going to knock away some demand. Some firms aren't going to set up because my bribe demands are higher. But half of that is happening to the other bureaucrat. He's driving away the firms that would be paying the other bureaucrat. So he's only seeing half the problem, and he's more willing to raise his fee. And that generalizes. The more bureaucrats there are, the less they care about the negative impact of raising their fee, because it happens mostly to other bureaucrats. And so they see all the benefit and less of the cost. And so essentially this externality leads them to overcharge. And you end up with, in aggregate, more fees in aggregate for firms. And you can have firms completely almost driven out of operation, which is collectively irrational, but privately rational for the bureaucrats. They would prefer to collude and say, let's lower our fees so we actually can get some bribe revenue. But if they're acting privately, they may not be able to do that.
So to start a business, like apart from uh, like doing your own business, like there are some stuffs like for you kind of pay for the place like that you got, but you also need to pay for the agencies to operate your business, right?
Right. Yeah. So we're looking at paying your normal costs, but then in addition, paying fees in the model. Basically paying bribes to, yeah, in order to operate your firm.
So this is must be done stuff like uh yeah, also like legally and like yeah. And all right, my next question: why do high salaries and voting fail to stop corruption where there are too many agencies?
Good question. So yeah, these are two anti-corruption mechanisms that multiple economists have studied. One is efficiency wages. You pay bureaucrats enough, pay them above their market wage, and dismiss them if they get caught in corruption. Then they have an incentive to refrain from corruption in order to keep their lucrative job. That goes back to Becker and Stigler. Another one is electoral accountability. If you can vote people out of office based on corruption, then obviously that gives some ability to discipline corruption and potentially lower corruption. But what this paper shows is that in this decentralized context, both of these mechanisms are less valuable, less effective. And the reason is, uh, you know, the reason is as you try to hold down bureaucrats' corruption levels, right? Like, let's say you say, we'll pay this great salary. You got to keep your corruption below some level, maybe zero, or maybe some low level, uh, or else we're going to dismiss you from your job. All right. So they're thinking about it. But the thing is, uh, now if there's just one bureaucrat, right, the bureaucrat's thinking, well, I keep my wage or I grab the corrupt fees that they're saying are off limits to me.
Mhm.
So that's my trade-off, right? And if you set the wages right, you can set the wages enough such that the bureaucrat decides I'm gonna not be corrupt. I'll keep the wage instead. It's a great wage. But now let's say you have 10 bureaucrats.
Mhm.
They're all saying, do I keep my wage or do I grab the corruption? But the thing is, when you've lowered everyone's corruption level, any one of them, if they deviate, if they say, no, I'm not satisfied with the wage, I'm going to be corrupt, any one of them can grab the entire, they can act as a monopoly.
Mhm.
Um, if they're the only one deviating, they can be corrupt and be the monopoly bureaucrat essentially. So you have to pay all 10 as if they are the only one being corrupt. And that gets very expensive as you get
Mm.
more bureaucrats. Uh, and it, in fact, becomes inefficient to pay and you simply give up. Uh, so uh, basically, the idea is you try to suppress a bunch of people where any one of them can jump in and get the whole pot. You have to pay all of them based on the whole pot, basically. That's roughly the logic. This, by the way, came up in another paper by Besley and Pratt talking about media. If you just have one media company, one TV company or newspaper, the government could pay them off to not run certain stories or whatever. Uh, but if you have 10, you have to pay all 10 the same because any one of them could run the story. And then it becomes maybe prohibitively costly to buy off the media uh, if you have lots of. So it's the same thing here, but it works in a different direction. There, you'd want to have lots of media. Here, if you have lots of bureaucrats, any one of whom can take up the slack and take advantage of uh, no one else charging bribes, then it turns out to be very costly to compensate them. Uh, so, so that's the basic idea, and it's similar for democracy. Again, you're telling them we were going to vote you out of office if you exceed some limit, maybe zero, maybe something positive. But the temptation is growing with the number of bureaucrats out there because anyone can jump in and grab the entire set of bribes that would be available. And that temptation grows overwhelming as the number of bureaucrats gets large. So, so that's the idea there.
Mhm. So bureaucrats, if you do not pay, bureaucrats can shut down your business whenever they want, like something like that.
Yeah, the way this model works is uh, bureaucrats can charge bribes, and you have to pay if you want to operate your firm.
Mhm.
So you might say, well, why don't they just charge $1 million? Well, if they do that, then no one's going to set up a firm and pay them anything.
So they also have some benefit. Like I mean, they will like if someone kind of sets up some kind of operation, there is benefit to them. Like so they're not like stopping them completely. Like I mean, not discouraging. Instead, I kind of encouraging them to set up this like these businesses so that they can get money from them, like or something like that.
Yeah, the model. Yeah, so two sides of the market, right? You have the entrepreneurs, and
Hmm.
they would like to set up a firm if if they're a skilled entrepreneur and they can earn more that way than going out and looking for a job. Of course, they take into account they might have to pay some bribes that will eat into their profits. Uh, and then the other side of the market is the bureaucrats, and they can, sort of given they have some exogenous power to extract bribes. Um, in the base model, as much as they can charge whatever they want, but why won't they charge, $1 million? Well, because If they do that, then maybe very few firms will
Mm,
set up, maybe none, and then they don't get any bribe revenue. And so
mhm,
basically, they're going to moderate their corruption level in
mhm,
order to maximize their corrupt revenues. If they
uh-huh,
charge too much, they don't get much revenue because no one's
mhm,
actually setting up firms. This is, you look at like Indonesia under Suharto, which has been written about, that it was kind of like a well-known 10% corruption tax. 10% is not, you know, it won't kill your entire business sector. In fact, you might say it's kind of a small tax on this grand scale if you have the power to tax at 80%. But it may be sort of the profit maximizing tax because, the old phrase, you don't want to kill the golden goose, the goose that lays the golden eggs. Um, so, you want to keep your business sector alive. Otherwise, you're not going to get any revenue.
mm. So like setting up business is actually more difficult than looks on the surface, right?
That was the idea of the paper, and it was again inspired a lot by Kazakhstan, and at least this was in 1995, so kind of right during the middle of the transition and even depression. But apparently, there was a lot of corruption. The people we talked to in teaching small business about different people you'd have to pay off to set up a firm legally. So,
Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Got it. And my next question, why does income inequality first rise and then fall as corruption increases?
yeah, it's exactly what we were talking about just now, which is at low levels of corruption, you have kind of just a natural state of inequality. There's some people who earn more than others, they're better entrepreneurs, but nothing exorbitant. Uh, People who don't set up firms work for wages in a competitive labor market in this model. So there's not a lot of, inherent inequality. As corruption rises, uh, you end up impoverishing those who are vulnerable to corruption,
Mm-hmm.
whether they're entrepreneurs, because if they're entrepreneurs, they get taxed for lower profits, or whether they're workers, because this is going to lower labor demand and lower the wage. So you sort of impoverish that section and you enrich the section who's collecting the bribes. Um, and that's why inequality rises. But then if you charge too much, your corruption is measured as how much you have to pay to set up a firm. Uh, if that gets too high, then you just don't get anyone setting up firms, or very few. So very few bribes are changing hands. So we're not enriching
Mm-hmm.
the, the official class, the bureaucrats. The other folks are poor, made poor by corruption, but the bureaucrats aren't collecting much anyway. And so inequality has dropped. So this is back to like what we were talking about. Like it may be that corruption of 10% maximizes inequality because you get these massive bribe revenues across a flourishing economy going to, two or three families or whatever. And that's a lot of inequality.
Mm-hmm.
But if inequality was 80%, sorry, corruption was 80%, you would have very little corruption changing, bribes changing hands, and you wouldn't have a very rich ruling family or ruling elite.
Thank you, Professor. And my last question for your research paper: how do high bribes force smart people into low-paying work while letting connected people run businesses? Because like I heard some like Nikola Tesla, like he kind of died poor because he didn't have a strong connection, but he was very clever, you know. So and he kind of died like with a lot of he didn't pay a lot of bribe. I mean not bribes uh well how to say like he need to pay basically. He need to pay for a lot of things like for his taxes, but he didn't pay who he couldn't afford it. So What do you think? Like, how do high bribes force smart people into low-paying work while letting connected people run businesses?
Yeah. Uh, what's happening in that model, and I think in some real world cases, um, you have kind of different barriers to entrepreneurship.
Mm-hmm.
The average person, maybe Nikola Tesla, who's not connected or not, just an average person who's very clever, but would have to pay a lot to go through all these hurdles and pay off all these bureaucrats in order to run an official firm. And you can look at also work by Fernando de Soto looking at Peru, um, about sort of all the barriers to entrepreneurship. An old book in the 80s, I think, called the Other Path. But uh, but then so what that does is it gives that person a choice of being an entrepreneur, but not earning very much because a lot of your money is going towards bribery, et cetera, or working, as a for wages and maybe not earning as much as well there. Versus, what about connected entrepreneurs? So here we're thinking again, maybe uh, uh, if you're well connected, if you, for example, in the transition period in Kazakhstan, if you happen to be a high ranking official in the party and you have these connections already or put power in place, you might be able to set up a firm and avoid paying all these bribes because no one would dare to bother you, or if you're the nephew of the president or something like that. So you can get people who may not be very talented at all, but have the right connections, and it becomes cost effective for them to set up the firm, not the very talented but unconnected person. And that's a misallocation of talent and resources in the economy. You don't want just the nephew of the president setting up firms. You want
Mm.
people who are actually good at it. Now, maybe he is good, but you want the market to sort of select those who are pretty good at it rather than the sort of corrupt setting. So that's one point that that paper makes.
Mm-hmm. Uh, Thank you, Professor. Those were my all questions for you. Yeah, thank you for being our guest today. I really do appreciate it. Yeah. So good luck on your future research papers.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And how's Uzbekistan?
Charge money, and yeah, it's not applied, but there is this kind of rumor. So and there are other news going on. So yeah, but not much about economics for now. Yeah.
Okay.